Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the Polis Project Digital Book Salon. My name is Michael Busch, and I'm the Director of Public Programs at the Polis Project. Today, we're pleased to be joined by Dr. Aliyah Khan, Associate Professor of English and Afroamerican and African Studies at the University of Michigan, and the author of the book that we're going to be discussing today, Far from Mecca, Globalizing the Muslim Caribbean, out now from Rutgers University Press. Welcome, Dr. Khan, to the Polis Project Virtual Book Salon.
Hi, Michael. Thank you so much for inviting me to be on here today.
It's our pleasure. And before we get started, just a brief note to our audience. As always with these book salons, the goal is to the extent possible, simulate an actual book event like we would have during normal times when we could be in conversation together physically. So to the extent possible, what that means is that we're going to try to encourage a dialogue. And so if you're out there watching on Twitter, YouTube, or Facebook, and you have a question that you would like us to ask Dr. Khan throughout the course of this conversation, feel free to plug it in the comments or tweet it at us at project_polis. And if time permits, we will try to weave it into the conversation. But without further ado, I'd like to just get started. So Aliyah, before discussing the substance of Far From Mecca in detail, I was hoping that we could start the conversation by having you talk a little bit about the origins of the book and why you chose to write it.
Thank you for that framing question. I could give you the thoroughly scholarly answer, which is that, Islam in the Caribbean is a vastly understudied subject. But I'm also going to give you an answer that's important, or a complicated answer that's important to me in both political and community organizing kinds of terms. I have a couple of different goals here. One is to decenter the place of the United States in the study of Islam in the region, by which I mean the hemispheric Americas, right? And to specifically decenter the event of 9/11 as the defining moment and the defining lens through which we look at Muslims and Islam and Muslim history in not just the United States, but in the entire American region. I also have some other goals that are more, kind of local to the Caribbean and Caribbean politics, which is, in general, Islam is thought of as the religion of the descendants of indentured Indian laborers, from the 19th and early 20th century in the Caribbean. And that is just not necessary. That is just not really true, in terms of who Muslims are now in the Caribbean, right? They are certainly people who are, descendants of Indian indentured laborers, but there are also people who are Black Caribbean people, not just people who have converted as, one might assume, but people who have been Muslim for generations. There's also a long history of African Islam in the region that I would specifically like to point to. Mm-hmm. So all of those regions that kind of, intersect in both scholarly and, political terms.
Terrific. So to turn to the book itself, you offer throughout a close reading of literary texts, music, and other documents to demonstrate, one of the overarching themes of your study, and namely the figure of the Caribbean Muslim in both, and you argue that this figure is both dynamic and fluid across time and space. And you start the book with an analysis of memoirs by two enslaved Africans who were brought to Jamaica in the 19th century. And you connect them with the modern day poetry of Abdur-Rahman Slade Hopkinson to show a kind of a continuity of Sufi aesthetics in Afro-Caribbean literature over time. So I was hoping that you could talk to us a little bit about the work of these three men and how you understand the linkages that conceptually bind them across the century that divides them.
That's a really complicated question. So I'll start off by saying who the three men are. There are two particular two men who were early 19th century, who both produced texts that were sort of combination autobiographies, but also religious texts, right? They're essentially they remembered from their own religious training in West Africa. One of them, the scholars who've translated have given it the name the Kitab al-Salat, the book on praying, but it was not titled by the man who wrote it himself. So his name was he was from Nigeria, and the manuscript dates from around 1820. The other West African manuscript, so I should say that both of these men were enslaved in Jamaica. The other one is from around 1834, and it's a similar kind of combination of this is my personal history, but this is also precepts that I remember from my Muslim religious training in West Africa. Kaba, as I said, was from Ivory Coast. Abu Bakr was from Timbuktu, which had been a center of Islamic learning since the 14th or 15th centuries. A very important thing to note is that, like theirs was not a kind of generic generic Sunni Islam that, one might assume you might find in the Caribbean, but they were both trained in West African Sufi traditions, in particular the Qadiriya Tariqa, which is like a brotherhood. And those teachings, you can see them in their autobiographical works. So there are these two texts, Jamaica, early 1800s, and then, as you mentioned, there is also, the work of a poet that I like to call the Muslim Poet Laureate of the Caribbean. He's deceased, but he is from my home country of Guyana, Abdurrahman Slade Hopkinson. He's a very prolific poet. I think his work too is very much understudied, but just in terms of, and he himself drew a lot of inspiration from poets like Rumi, Hafiz, other poets who are very well known in the Sufi poetic tradition. So one thing that I'm trying to do is I'm establishing all kinds of links between these men as in terms of thinking about a legacy of African Islam in the Caribbean, but not just, and Black Islam in the Caribbean, but not just any, a kind of generic African Islam in the Caribbean, but one that specifically draws on Sufi religion and literary aesthetics. We can point to one literary device that I see across their works that links them across time is a real attention. It's an attention to a precept that is both religious and literary. The concept of batin, which is that which is hidden, right? So you think about, so not just like what is, so in two ways. One, what is hidden in the text in literary terms and, in terms of wordplay and so on, but also what is hidden for the author. For the men who were enslaved, they were ostensible converts to Christianity who, because of course they were enslaved. And, so they gained power on the plantations on which they worked on by becoming nominally converted to Christianity. But nonetheless, even while they called themselves Christians, they were still writing texts that, recalled themselves as Muslims. So, what is hidden there? I mean, it's their Islam and their memories of their lives in West Africa.
Mm-hmm. And as a kind of counterpoint to this discussion of Afro-Caribbean Muslim men, you also look and you pivot, I think, pretty strongly in the book to looking at Indo-Caribbean Muslim women. And there's a lot to cover here, and I want to start with sort of the framework I think that you introduce to think through some of these questions, and it's a two-tiered one, I think, or at least it sort of gives us two sort of different overarching arguments. One, you suggest that the Indo-Caribbean identity sort of defines itself in some measure in opposition to the Afro-Caribbean by emphasizing Indian women's submission to patriarchy. And second, that Indo-Caribbean Muslims then position themselves in opposition to the Hindu majority by insisting on a proper Islamic behavior by Muslim women. Can you tease this out for us a little bit and talk about how you see this process unfolding in the Indo-Caribbean particularly?
Mm-hmm. I can tease them out by, I'll link them, right? Because one thing that we can just say about community, in terms of identity community formation for Indo-Caribbean Muslims, as it does really for almost any ethnic community or religious community, or one certainly that is kind of, in formation, in post-colonial formation, is that it kind of happens on the backs of women. And and the way that women's moral behavior is perceived, and which includes like the way they dress, the way they speak, and then particularly how they interact in the public sphere as opposed to the private sphere, both in religious terms and in ethnic terms in the Caribbean. The definition of what an Indo-Caribbean Muslim is tends to hinge on how women act. Or how women dress, right? Like how do they look in the public sphere? What is their level of interaction with men? What is their religious participation? What is their participation in civic life? So it's that they are being, it's something about identity community identity formation. Women define how the Indo-Caribbean Muslim community is perceived, both in ethnic and religious terms.
Yeah, and as part of this, you recount the story of Anissa Ahmed, who was the first woman to deliver a sermon in a mosque during Friday prayers. Can you recount this history for us a little bit and talk about the ways in which it turns notions of proper behavior on their heads and its significance, not just for Indo-Caribbean women particularly, but Muslim women more broadly across the Caribbean?
So this is a really interesting story. Anissa Ahmed, who I should say, like so many other immigrants to the United States, she's one thing in the country that she came from, but now she's an oncologist in Miami, which is where I met her and talked to her. So she's very much she's a real person, right? A regular person. So in 1995, Anissa Ahmed was the first woman to give a khutbah, a Friday sermon after Friday Jummah prayers that we know of in a mosque in the Caribbean. She was also one of the very first in the Americas to do so. There are women who, have done so in the U.S. A few people in South Africa, and so on. But she's certainly the first one that I know of to do so. Give a Friday sermon essentially on the most important day of the Islamic week in a mosque. So she gave this khutbah in a mosque in Freeport, Trinidad. She was a member of the Ahmadiyya sect of Muslims who are known for, they are persecuted in Pakistan, their place of origin, but they are known for their progressivism in the Caribbean, and they have a striking number of adherents in the Caribbean as a result of Pakistani missionizing work in the Caribbean in the early 20th century. So what's interesting, or there are many interesting things about it. First, the fact that it could happen at all, right? That a woman could. It's not that she led prayers. She didn't do that. But she did give this khutbah, this sermon. There are some interesting things there about reception. She was encouraged. She told me when I spoke to her about it in an interview that she was encouraged to do so by the imam of her mosque and by elders of the mosque. So it was not something that the members of the mosque were, they were not against it. They were all for it, and they were proud that she was doing it. Her reception by the Trinidadian public, and I think the wider Muslim ummah, the wider Muslim world public, once this story was publicized by the BBC in 1995, was kind of mixed. Trinidadians themselves kind of took the position that they were proud that their country was a first, and their people were first to do this kind of thing. But there were all, and what was interesting about the way Trinidadians reacted to it was that their resistance to her doing it didn't come from the fact of her doing it. Some of them were just upset that they didn't think she covered up enough, that she did cover her head and so on, as Muslim women do in mosques. But she pointed out that she wasn't wearing like a full abaya, and some people had objections to that. They think she didn't cover up enough, and that was also part of the reaction, right? When people learned about this people worldwide learned about this through the BBC. It is a significant thing in the sense that it happened at all. Muslim women don't typically give the khutbah even now after Friday prayers, usually, as most people probably know, the women's section in a mosque is separate from the men's section, and the leading of the prayers and the sermons and so on, it happens in the men's section.
Yeah, makes sense. To stay on despite the focus, throughout on literary musical texts that you engage with, one of the most important features, I think, of your study is the recounting of political history in Trinidad, and specifically the attempted coup by the Jamaat al-Muslimin in Trinidad. Can you talk about this story? Like what happened? Because I think, I was only sort of vaguely aware of this. So if you could sort of talk about the coup itself, discuss the ways in which it changed national perceptions of Islam in the country.
I haven't. Can you hear me?
Oh, I think you were on mute.
Okay.
There we go.
So I have an overarching argument about the significance of this coup. So in July 1990, 114 members of this group called the Jamaat al-Muslimin, which was predominantly an Afro-Trinidadian Muslim, Black nationalist Muslim group would be a good way to frame it, led by Imam Yassin Abu Bakr, essentially staged an attempted coup of the Trinidadian government. They took over the seat of parliament in Trinidad, which is called the Red House. They firebombed police headquarters. They took over Trinidad and Tobago's main radio and television station and started their own broadcast for a couple of days. This is a really important event. I mean, imagine an Islamic coup, right, in a Caribbean island in 1990. That is something outside of the perception of anything that both Caribbean people thought was possible, and like, I guess Muslims around the world, right? We're not particularly paying attention to the Caribbean or to Trinidad as a locus of any kind of Muslim activity, or as a place that even had Muslims. Period. To be frank. So one of the big overarching arguments that I'm making here is that 9/11 is not the 9/11 is not the big event for the Caribbean. In terms of the general public's perception that Muslims are associated with terrorist activity, and just a general knowledge that the community exists at all. The lens through which people in the Caribbean tend to see Muslims and the existence of Muslims, the historical existence of Muslim in the Caribbean, that's the event. Like, that's the event for the Caribbean. It's not 9/11. It's this coup.
And as part of your analysis of the coup and the Trinidadian politics that follow it, you look at the role of Calypso music, but in a number of different ways. And I wanted to just sort of pick this apart briefly. One is, you talk about how Calypso music was actually played by the group that was attempting the coup during the period of the coup. And then you also talk about the ways in which, it sort of played a role in incorporating, almost like the mythology of the event in the national imaginary. So I was wondering if you could sort of speak to both of these. First, sort of like, how did the music, or like what role did the music play during the coup? And in what ways sort of, did it help people or sort of suggest or encourage a way of thinking about the coup as an historical event? And then finally, sort of as another piece of this question, you make the argument that in many ways this role that Calypso played actually encouraged people to think about this event, the coup, as something that had connections to the history of slave rebellions throughout the Caribbean. Could you speak to those aspects of Calypso and the coup?
Okay, so we can spend forever talking about Muslim music in the Caribbean, right? We do. And I really think that you can't really talk about cultural history and just culture in general in the Caribbean without talking about the musical context and music. Music is not necessarily the first thing people think about when they're thinking about Muslim religious communities or an event that's associated with terrorism and Islam anywhere in the world. But that's not true in the Caribbean because it's the Caribbean. So one thing that happened when the Muslimin and Imam Yassin Abu Bakr took over Trinidad and Tobago's radio and TV station is that he basically started playing his personal playlist of his favorite calypsos, and particularly like political ones. And he's very much invested. When I spoke to him, I interviewed him for this book. He's very much invested in his love for and knowledge of calypso as a political musical tradition in the Caribbean. He does not see it as something that is separate from his Islam, right? His practice of the religion. He's very proud of the fact that, like, even up to this day, he's still mentioning calypsos as a political figure. He thinks of it. The man basically thinks of himself as kind of a calypso king of Trinidad. So there's that. But then there's also that I think an argument that I made is that in order for Trinidadians to think about this coup as an event that was there, as an event that was theirs, and in a way that creolized, to use the most popular paradigm for studying Caribbean culture and literature, the way that Trinidadians creolized this event into Trinidad's history, right, and made it like a kind of give themselves kind of a hybrid understanding of how this could be both a Muslim event and an Islamic event and a Trinidadian event, was through music. So in this event, this coup happened in July 1990, and Carnival, Trinidad's Carnival, which is the biggest event of the year, was the next year in February 1991, and a large proportion of the competitive Calypso songs that that Calypsonians put out were about the coup. There are two. There are a couple of really well-known ones by the Calypsonians, Brother Ebony, Crocro, and David Rudder, all of whom I was able to speak to. It's a really interesting things to be able to talk to these guys at their homes. In one case, the Vincent, and in other cases, Trinidad. This is the way that the coup became incorporated into Trinidadian history and Trinidadians' narratives of themselves. Once it's in song, once it's memorialized into song, it is a part of Trinidadian history, and it is a part of Trinidadian politics. Right, the music is that important. Right, in some ways, we might think of music as, maybe we might say that music is what comes from the culture, but in fact, in these cases, I think music sometimes determines the culture. Like this is really true of calypsos in the Caribbean. And then the part of your question that was about the coup as something that connects the coup to slave rebellions of the past. That happened in particular in one of David Rudder's, the Calypsonian David Rudder's song that links the coup to the festival of Hussein, otherwise sometimes known as Muharram, and that was essentially it's an event on the in particular Shia Muslim religious calendar that celebrates the martyrdom of Hassan and Hussein in Islam, and the Battle of Karbala, right, which is an important battle in Islamic religious history. So it's a very involved process in the Caribbean, where there are parades and processions with model tombs. People spend entire years building these model tombs, and so on. But it is this was that festival of Hussein and Muharram had a really interesting trajectory in the 19th century Caribbean, where yes, it was brought to the Caribbean, Trinidad, Guyana, and Suriname, and Jamaica in particular, by Indian indentured laborers, but it became taken up in a kind of carnival way by Afro-Caribbean people too, who began participating in the festival of Hussein, even though they, it still retained its religious origins and its ethnic origins. In Guyana and Trinidad, the free practice of this Hussein event with the model tombs and the processions and so on was ended by law, and particularly in Trinidad's case, by the violent actions of the British colonial government, which people were outlawed. The ceremony was outlawed from people. The processions were outlawed from, for example, in Guyana, from entering what was in the capital and the main town of Georgetown and Amsterdam. In Trinidad, people were barred from the processions entering, the main parts of the capital in Port of Spain. And then at one point, the British colonial government militias opened fire on people who were involved in the festival, because it was viewed, in my opinion, as it was one of the early sites in which people could see a kind of religious political unity happening between Black and Indian populations, and I think that was certainly viewed as a threat by the British colonial government.
One of the concepts that surfaces in your examination of post-coup Calypso is the idea of Muslim time. And you apply this concept in your analysis of the book Allah and the Islands by Brenda Flanagan, who also happens to be the sister of Abu Bakr, who you were describing before as the coup leader. I'm hoping that you could talk about what Muslim time is, how we should think about that as a concept, how we see it at work in Flanagan's novel, and for that matter, how we see it in working within the coup, and how it helps us to understand and see the practice of Islam as simultaneously global and local.
So I link my answer to this question back to what I was just talking about, the festival of Hussein, and this particular Calypso by David Rudder the Trinidadian Calypsonian. So the phrase Muslim time, I borrow from one of his calypsos about the coup. In that calypso, he talks about the coup as something strange. He references the moon and how strange it looked. Of course, the moon has heavy symbolism in Islam. He just talks about just the strangeness of the atmosphere. He uses the phrase "strange dogs were barking," but in the calypso, he directly links the coup to that same Indo-Muslim festival of Hussein that was outlawed by the British, violently outlawed by the British. He's the one who actually did this work in the song. Again, thinking about how important songs and music are for Trinidadians and Caribbean people in general, thinking about their history. So in the song, he links Hussein, the colonial festival, with the coup by insinuating that both of them is something that he calls Muslim time. So Muslim time is something, first in the song, it's something strange. It's something that is new to Trinidadians, or at least it's something that they were not used to thinking. It is something outside of their usual perceptions of cultural hybridity. It is just something that feels like it is new, but one thing he's suggesting that in the Calypso is that it is in fact not new, right? Because even though they're thinking about the coup as a new thing, Muslims are a new thing on the Caribbean scene, he's saying, well, we had Hussein already in the colonial context. So establishing there for Trinidadians and Caribbean people in general, the idea that Islam is not new to the Caribbean and did not suddenly appear in the Caribbean in 1990 because of this coup. And, in terms of it pointing to Islam as simultaneously local and global, that's how, right? I mean, like, it has been a part of Islam has been part of Trinidadian history since, since the colony of Trinidad, right? The inception of the colony of Trinidad, but it is also linked in various ways to global Islam. One thing that I talked about in the book is the investment, economic investment is part of it, but also religious investment of non-aligned Libya during the Cold War in the Muslim Caribbean under the auspices of Muammar Gaddafi's government. When suddenly realized that there were Muslims in the Caribbean. I mean, it starts off as like an interest that Libya as a non-aligned country has in, the Caribbean itself, Guyana as a non-aligned country too, that was flirting with socialism at that time. It starts off like that on a political level, but then, the Libyans suddenly realized that there were Muslims in Guyana and started sending missionaries in the 70s and 80s. And there is one guy in particular who was, an important Libyan diplomat in Guyana that had a very, Ahmed Ehwas, who was affiliated with the Libyan Call Society, and he had a very outsized impact on what Islam looks like in Guyana today. So there's just all this back and forth, right, that we can point to. One important thing that I want to say, though, in terms of Islamic history in the Caribbean is it doesn't start with, or in the Americas in general, it doesn't start with, I said it doesn't start with 9/11, but it also doesn't start with this coup, nor does it start with these 1800s autobiographies from Jamaica that we started off by talking about. It's Islamic history in the Americas begins with the Moriscos, enslaved North Africans from the Maghreb, who were brought on expeditions of exploration by Portuguese and Spanish explorers from the 1490s onward. These people didn't leave a lasting legacy, but if you're thinking about history of Islam in the Americas, it starts from the inception of colonies and colonization in the Americas.
Yeah, without a doubt. Just really to hold for a moment on this topic. You spent some time in the book talking about that relationship between Guyana and some of the other countries in the region and Libya as part of like the non-aligned movement, but sort of moving forward from that point on. Can you describe that relationship a little bit more? And I'm also just curious, for my own benefit, sort of how that relationship has come to be viewed in the contemporary moment as well.
Yeah, this is a really interesting linkage that I discovered while writing the book. that it's one of the things that I'd like to look into further, that I simply, didn't have time, room, or that wasn't the project at the time, right? So it's this very interesting thing that I said happened in the 1970s when, Libya was involved. Libya as a non-aligned country was involved in all of this non-aligned political activity, like similar with similar countries around the world. Guyana, in particular, being part of it, right? So it begins, as I said, with this political linkage, right, and economic investment. Like, for example, Libya sent or like invested in fishing trawlers in Guyanese waters. It was about that like 60s, 70s moment of like third world solidarity and linkages between those countries that were kind of shut out during the Cold War. So it starts there. But then my read of it is that, people affiliated with the Libyan Call Society and Muammar Gaddafi's government came to understand that there were these Muslims in the Caribbean, and in particular in Trinidad and Guyana, but that there was a particular concern that they had somehow fallen outside because of colonization, because of the way that they're cut off from their origins in India and any kind of linkage to the Arab world. There was this perception that they needed to be kind of like folded back into the Ummah. So Libya, and then later on Saudi Arabia and the UAE did things like, sent Qurans to these countries. They sent missionaries, and they also financially supported starting from the 70s, sending young men abroad to study in places like Libya and then Egypt, and like to lesser extent Saudi Arabia. So what the Libyans saw, and when what early Arabs, I guess, coming into the Caribbean saw, for economic and political reasons, where people who call themselves Muslims, but they were certainly affiliated with what we could call an Indo-Iranian branch of, or Indo-Iranian kind of Islam, which is primarily Sunni, certainly from the Hanafi school, just for like historical reasons. But there are ways in which their culture bled into the Hindu Indian culture of the majority Indo-Caribbean that did not seem to be quite so Islamic, right? And that's one of the, like culture versus religion is like the issue for Muslims in the Caribbean today, and for Hindus in the Hindu descendants of adventure in the Caribbean today too. It's like, how do you separate out one concern of, how do you separate out what could be called Indo-Iranian culture from what should be the quote unquote proper practice of Islam? And when Libyan missionaries and diplomats and so on ended up in Guyana, that's what they were concerned with. They're affiliated with organizations that still have some pull, some pull in Guyana today. The Central Islamic Organization of Guyana being one of them. I'm not saying they're still on the scene. Those guys are long gone. The Libyans are long gone. I'm not saying they're long gone. They got bigger problems right now, okay? In Libya. So this man, Ahmad Ehwas, who was, the major Libyan diplomat in Guyana in the 70s and 80s, as I said, he really played an outsized role in introducing what they thought of as like a proper Arab Islam, a more conservative Arab Islam that had to do with things about the mixing of sexes and so on into Guyana. But a lot of people, remember him fondly. He was later on killed in an attempted coup against Gaddafi in Libya itself. But a lot of people, it's so strange, right, that a lot of people, Muslims in Guyana, remember this Libyan fondly. There's also some linkage too between the Libyan Call Society and Trinidad in the person of Imam Yassin Abu Bakr, who led that 1990 coup. He as at one time was a missionary for the Libyan Call Society and had ties to their various involvements around the Caribbean.
Yeah,
but I would not. I'm sorry. I would not describe him as an agent of Libya, though, which is one thing that was alleged by the Trinidadian government at the time of the coup.
Right. Yeah. I mean, when I was reading that part of the book, it struck me that, one of the, I believe, if I'm not mistaken, one of the early non-aligned movement meetings and gatherings happened in Georgetown in Guyana. And I was thinking, those linkages, politically, socially, and otherwise must also sort of feed into the developments that happened later. I wanted to, just turn briefly to thinking about kind of two of the big giants of Caribbean literature, Derek Walcott and V.S. Naipaul, who I think are kind of inescapable in some respects. And, they do certainly figure into your study. And I wanted to spend some time talking about Naipaul's idea of the mimic man. But before we get there, what was also sort of striking about the book was, you don't spend a whole lot of time on Derek Walcott, but he sort of bookends the study. He's right at the beginning of the introduction, and then he sort of reappears at the end with a quote that you use to sort of frame out, his influence. And I'm wondering if you could just briefly talk about how Walcott engaged with issues of Islam on the one hand and sort of Muslim Caribbeans on the other.
Yeah, you're right? Like the more one tries to decenter the importance of Derek Walcott and V.S. Naipaul in Caribbean literature, like the harder it just gets. They're just there, whether you want them to be or not. Okay, so I start off by talking about Derek Walcott's Nobel Prize speech, Nobel Prize in Literature speech. He and Naipaul being, the Caribbean's Nobel Prize in Literature winners. So I start off by talking about his speech when he got the prize, which is really interesting because he foregrounds this Hindu religious ceremony called the Ram Leela, where it's a play, right, that enacts the story of the Ramayana and Lord Ram's and Sita's and Lakshman's exile from their home of Ayodhya, which is an exile story that Hindus in the Caribbean strongly resonate with. So he talks about that, but in talking about that, he also notes the existence of what he calls minarets against the Antillean sky, and it's that image that gave me pause when I started this project. Like, what does it mean to see minarets against the Antillean sky? To see this the visual marker of Islam against a Caribbean scene, right? Like the Caribbean tropics, like that typical blue sky, beach, palm tree kind of scene, right? The image, the juxtaposition is striking. The strangeness of the juxtaposition is striking, right? So what I wanted to do is just look into the strangeness.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes sense. And then there's Naipaul, right? Who becomes very important towards the latter parts of the book when you invoke his idea of the Caribbean mimic man, which I think you use to great effect when you apply it to sort of the post 9/11 moment. Can you talk about this mimic man trope? What it is, how it animates what you refer to as ethno-Orientalism in the work of Jan Scheinborn, and what this might suggest about the changing nature, not just of religious identity in the Caribbean, but also of race.
Yeah. So first off, the mimic man that it's from his novel titled The Mimic Man, which, like so many of his other works, are about how does an Indo-Caribbean man define his own identity, or rather how he fails to be either Indian or Caribbean, right? At least in the literature of V.S. Naipaul. So it's from there. But then just in general, trope, the word you use is the right one, right, for what this is, as a way of thinking about post-colonial identity formation and post-colonial literature. So in general, that trope is just, we in post-colonial studies use mimic man as a way of thinking about what is the fate of the post-colonial after the colonizers leave. Right? Are they capable to what extent, how do they reform or form a culture, right? If you've been indentured, you've been enslaved, like what do you even remember from your ancestral cultures? To what extent are you still them? To what extent are you Caribbean? And then to what extent can you borrow or use what the colonizer left behind? So, Naipaul and Walcott have, or rather had, diametrically opposed views on this. So Naipaul is depressive. I mean, we know this, right? Like, he doesn't have too much hope, or he didn't, right? No. He didn't have too much hope, or they are both. he didn't have too much hope, or rather, his literature doesn't suggest a huge amount of hope for the fate of the post-colonial after the colonizer leaves. Like, the post-colonial man is doomed to mimicry. All he can do, he is a mimic man doomed to mimicry. All he can do is imitate in the Caribbean, in the Anglophone Caribbean, British culture, British literature, British education, and maybe most importantly, British systems of government. I mean, in the Caribbean, we're in the Anglophone Caribbean, in Jamaica, Guyana, Trinidad in particular, we are still stuck with all these vestiges of British common law that people seem incredibly wedded to, right? Anytime they even come up for debate in Parliament. But yeah, it's this idea that like we're just stuck with the vestiges of colonialism, whether we want them or not, because we have nothing else, right? We can't recall our ancestral cultures from Africa, India, and wherever else, China. But we have no better ways of trying to think of something new. Derek Walcott has a kind of opposing point of view where he suggests in many of his essays and his work, directly and indirectly, that mimicry is a place to start. It's an okay place to start, right? In terms of thinking about what post-colonial culture is, because where else can you start? Like, you don't have a choice. But it doesn't mean that that is what you are simply doomed to doing. For him, mimicry is generative. And it can be productive if it is just a way to start.
Yeah. And how do you use this trope in your analysis of Schoenberg's Chinese women? Can you talk a little bit about that book, why you think it's important, and how the mimic man sort of reveals something to us around questions of both religious identity, but also the sort of the ethnic or racial dynamics at play as well.
Right. Yes, you asked this question about this book and ethno-Orientalism. So Janela Scheinborn is a Guyanese author of Chinese descent, and she certainly writes about Chinese identity in the Caribbean, but also Indian identity in the Caribbean, or just the whole morass, right, of like what it means to have all of these many different ancestral identities in the Caribbean. So this book, just for people who are listening and maybe more familiar with Mohsen Hamid's The Reluctant Fundamentalist, right, that is a sort of character study of how it is that a young Muslim man becomes invested in or thinking about terrorism, or the path or taking a violent path against U.S. politics. It's like that. The trajectory of Scheinborn's novel Chinese Women is a little bit like that. It's a character exploration of a young man that essentially attempts to answer George Bush's post 9/11 question of why do they hate us. And it's a complex and different answer, right? In every case. In the Caribbean and in Scheinborn's novel, the main character, as he turns to thinking about violence against the United States and against just colonizing forces in general, as a result of his personal oppression as not just a young Indian man, but like a young Muslim in Guyana. That is the only, turning to Islam is how he begins to feel like a man, and how he begins to feel like he has a valid identity. Where ethno-Orientalism comes in is that it's a word that I coined to just I don't know if I'm 100% satisfied with this, but I'm not. Listen, I'm not. But it's a word that it's the best way that I could come up with to think about how it is that someone self-orientalizes and refigures their own ethnicity, not just in the way that they think, but also in the way that they physically present and the way that they ethnically present. So, borrowing from Edward Said's concept of Orientalism, right? What is Muslim, what is Arab, and how they're associated with different ways of being and thinking and looking. This is what the main character in this novel begins to do. He even begins to think of himself as more Muslim by, thinking that his nose has suddenly started looking more like a Semitic nose when he's an Indian man himself. It's dress. He thinks his own physical features have changed. He's ethnicizing himself, orientalizing himself. He is becoming the figure that I talk about as the word that I use in the book to describe a Caribbean Muslim is one that is Guyanese. It's Fulaman. Like that's the Creolese lingo for like a Muslim in Guyana. And it's a really interesting word though, that like even though people just kind of toss it around, they don't necessarily think of it as a word for Muslim. A slightly derogatory word for Muslim in Guyana and in the Caribbean. They don't necessarily think about what the origins of the word are, which is that Fulaman. It's from the West African tribal name Fulani, right? So right there in the word itself, implying that Muslims in Guyana and the Caribbean were originally West African.
Yeah, I was sort of struck by you discussed the end of that book, and Aziz's kind of response to the attacks on the World Trade Center on 9/11, and sort of feeling sort of like the idea of kind of being seen. And it strikes me that that's something that you explore throughout the book. But it was interesting also because you argue that he kind of buys in and begins to embody kind of these essentialist tropes, right? These essentialist Orientalist tropes around Muslims and violence and things. And yet you, as a sort of a counterpoint, I think offer, the sort of concluding thoughts of Abu Bakr, who sort of says, no, like that doesn't really make any sense at all. And if these things were true, then the coup would have played out completely differently, right? And probably quite a bit more violently as a result of that. And so it was a nice way to round out the study. We've got one. I don't know if you have a response to that. Sorry.
Oh, no, I mean, I think if we have an audience question, I'd love to answer.
Yeah, sure. It's the question is, what surprised you most in the research of this book, and did your thinking about the role of Islam in the Caribbean change during the process?
That's what surprised me most? Well, one thing that I've already discussed is the extent to which Arab mission, or the extent to which there was this strange moment of like Cold War Libyan involvement, Muslim religious involvement in the Caribbean. That is certainly one thing. I can't avoid saying that, like, and I know that we were probably going to talk about this, in our conclusion, but I can't avoid saying that I grew up as a member of this community. Right. So in some sense, I'm looking at my own community history, and I'm looking at my own personal history. And there are things that I wanted to know more about. One thing that really, I don't know if it's surprise, and I don't know what it says about me to read the Arabic the autobiographical manuscripts of the two men who were who were enslaved in Jamaica, and feel a really personal connection to them, as someone who is Muslim, even though it spans generation, it spans race, it spans gender, all of these different things, because it was so strange, right, when I read their autobiographies, to read to read things that I know. And like I think of as part of like my own identity. It was also very emotional for me to read those autobiographies too, because I mean, reading the something that was written in the hand of someone who was enslaved, right, but also is also educated, highly educated. So I had to think about myself as like both connected to these people. Religiously, and then as someone who lived in the Caribbean, but then also like as a scholar, like they're scholars. It's strange to read something that's written by an enslaved scholar. I thought about it. I was like, do I have more sympathy for these people because they're educated like I am, because they're highly educated, because you think that like, oh, maybe their suffering is greater because they were so important in their own societies and they were highly educated? Is there something that makes them suffer more because their thinking is like in some way refined? But no, that's not true, right? So I had to explore my own feelings.
Yeah. And it's something also that you mentioned that really stuck out to me about that piece of the book was just the degree to which it was the very identity of their being scholars that ultimately kind of privileged them in this odd way, even while they were suffering from this radical sort of disempowerment. And there's a tension there, I think, that's would be fascinating to continue to explore.
I agree with you. It is really interesting to think that they were okay. So it is simply true to say that some people who were highly educated and were enslaved on Caribbean plantations preferential treatment, or at least preferential placement in jobs, in terms of like jobs, like became drivers. In one case, became things like accountants, right? They could do jobs, frankly, that the people who enslaved them were not qualified to do in some cases, right? Some planters were highly uneducated. But it's interesting to think about the fact that they receive preferential treatment by dint of education. And it is also evident too from some of their writings, and not just from these Caribbean writings, but there are more of these kinds of writings in the United States, that they themselves saw themselves as maybe better than, but certainly different from the other Africans who were enslaved around them, but who were not educated and not Muslim. I mean, I mean, why not? They're people.
Yep.
That's exactly the thing. They're people.
So we're beginning to run a little bit short on time. So by way of wrapping up, I wanted to ask sort of about something you just touched on a moment ago, which is sort of like your sort of personal approach to writing this book. One of the things that really moved me, I think, throughout the course of the reading was the ways in which you sort of sprinkled hints around the text that sort of gesture to your personal connections to the history and traditions that you've described. You include here and there like family photographs, a passing reference to your own witnessing of significant political moments in history, and some of the familial connections to the characters that populate the story and the narrative that you weave. And so, in other words, my sense was that you were sort of quietly present throughout the text, and that leads me to ask you, can you talk about the ways in which you navigated the tensions between objectivity, scholarly objectivity on the one hand, and your personal truths, and how you understand yourself in relation to the archive with a capital A and the archives plural with a small a?
Yeah, that's such a complicated question for a scholar, right? A scholar in the North American Academy. So I'll just say, straight out the bat that I don't really necessarily believe that total scholarly objectivity is something that's possible at all. Yeah. So that's true. But then again, I wasn't attempting to be scholarly. I mean, my work is intersectional, right? It is literary studies. It is also historiography, and religious. To some extent, religious studies. I can't escape the fact that I am from the community that I'm writing about, and that I grew up witnessing some of the things that I talked about. And I think it is important to note that is, I think the best you can do. I don't think you can really be objective, but the best you can do is be clear about what your positionality is. Like what. Or we could go ahead and call it like what Michel Foucault calls your locus of enunciation. Like, this is mine. I'm a member of the community that I'm talking about. I also draw a lot of inspiration from Audre Lorde's concept of biomythography, where the speaking of your personal truths and like your personal history tells the story. That is how you tell the story of a community whose story has not been told. You tell it through its people. I mean, I am one of its people, and it's totally true that a little bit of show and tell. The cover of the book, it includes it's a picture of these Muslim women from colonial Guyana, and my grandmother, my mother, and my aunt are in the photo. There are also other photos too. There's one of my great grandfather who came to Guyana. So personal family history was really unavoidable here, but I didn't seek to avoid it because I don't think that it was possible in doing this work. It is what inspired this work. I really, I'm clear about the fact that I wanted to tell the story of a community whose story I don't think has particularly been told, but that it is also my community.
Yeah. Fabulous. Well, we are just about out of time. So Dr. Aliyah Khan, thank you so much for joining us today. This has been a fabulous conversation.
Thank you so much, Michael, for all of the questions, and to the audience too for listening in.
Thank you. And my thanks to Vaishali Patra and Anika Singh, who were the producers of today's event. And my thanks finally to those of you who are watching. We thrive on the support of our listeners and our audience and those that support us. So thank you. We'll be back again in 2 weeks' time with another one of these virtual book salons. But in the meantime, we hope that you keep safe, that you keep happy, and take good care. Goodbye.